our readers. Our next neologism, acroneologism, is MENA, Middle East Nervous Anxiety, which we mentioned earlier on. This is the second iteration, the second airing of this newly discovered and newly offered acroneologism. Where are we now? Is it near, middle, or far? Why does it unnerve the West? Why is it sometimes referred to as, quote, the region, unquote, for lack of a better name? What are its borders and coordinates exactly? Does it have a center, centers? Has fuzziness about its borders brought on confusion about what it actually is? Are we still so disorientated? I know, terrible pun, terrible pun. You should be thankful that I've saved you from all of those exhibition titles that we're all very well aware of. In DOHA, the session included Elif Batuman, Ala Younes, and Koyo Koyo. And I'm sure the spirit of that session will be channeled in this session today. The channeling will be done through Mr. Oscar Guardiola-Rivera, the dandy Colombian who lives in London, who, before he tells us himself, is a great dancer. Beat you to it. Oscar's a writer, a philosopher, a dancer. He put it in his bio. An art critic. He was the author of the really wonderful book, What If Latin America Ruled the World, which came out, and We All Dance Better. His forthcoming book is called Story of a Death Foretold. Oscar's guests today are Slavs and Tatars. They go by this mysterious collective name, and yet this gentleman is sitting here, and I'm sure everyone in the audience knows who he is, but we shall not mention his name, Slavs and Tatars. And we have Uzma Rizvi next to Slavs and Tatars, who's Assistant Professor of Anthropology and Urban Studies at the Pratt Institute of Art and Design, Brooklyn, New York. And last but not least, it's a great pleasure to have Sultan Sooud Al Qassemi return to the Global Art Forum. He was a stellar component of Global Art Forum 6 last year, the medium of media. So it's really wonderful to have him back. A multi-talented, hat-wearing individual who, on the one hand, is, I think, one of the most important and well-known commentators, one of the world's greatest retweeters ever known to Twitter, but also, importantly, is the founder of the Barjeel Art Foundation, which features his private collection of contemporary Arab artwork in curated public exhibitions. So will you please join me in welcoming our esteemed panel, Middle East Nervous Anxiety.
Our format is very simple. We are going to invite each one of our three speakers to give us their first reactions to the questions posited to us, and then I'm going to try and direct these towards a conversation / discussion / provocation. We are going to begin with Sultan and then Payem, and then we're going to finish with the last and best word. Without any further ado, Sultan, you begin.
So I was asked to speak about the theme of the Middle East. What is the Middle East? Is it Near East, Far East? What I think is that there is no clear-cut definition. The Middle East means different things for different people. People of the Gulf regard the Middle East differently than people of North Africa. I was at a forum 10 years ago where with this world leader, and this guy from the Gulf got up and said, please don't lump us in together with people in North Africa. We are in the Gulf. For us, the Middle East begins and ends oh, this is a bit too early to show this, but there you go. We regard the Middle East to start from the Gulf and ends in Egypt. That's our definition of Middle East. So I'm sure people in North Africa also have a different understanding. This is an image that was going around the internet a few years ago that created a lot of controversy. If you see, this is what a reimagined Middle East could look like, and I mean, you can make your own conclusions from that. I was in Rome a few months ago at NATO, and I was told that they were strictly forbidden from using the term Greater Middle East. Guess why? Because it was a Bush term, and they wanted to distance themselves from the Bush era. So they could use the term Wider Middle East. However, other people use larger Middle East. What do they have? Expansive Middle East, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, I think the Middle East I would use the term of Alan Greish, the famous French writer, who called it America's new backyard. Thank you.
So I wanted to focus on an area of our geographical remit, which is between, we describe it as between the former Berlin Wall and the Great Wall of China. And this remit for today's focus is Central Asia. You can scroll, please. Next slide. Central Asia is before doing that, I should also just wish everybody a Happy New Year, as Mariam Mona Lisa mentioned earlier. It's also an interesting way to describe or to define the region is through its rituals or through its folklore and not through geopolitical boundaries. Nowruz, as you know, is not just Iranians who celebrate, but also Turks, Kurds, Azeris, Uzbeks, Tajiks, and Pakistanis, and many more nationalities. So one of the reasons why we look at Central Asia and is it happens to kind of triangulate between these two, what are considered these two extremes, balancing between these, sort of trying to fit two different registers, two different voices, two different ideas that are considered to be antithetical or mutually exclusive in one page or one space or one register or one voice is very important for us. In English, there's many terms for this. All of them seem to us quite pretentious. Amphiboly is one of them, coincidentia oppositorum in Latin, cognitive dissonance. We prefer the term the metaphysical splits, kind of like doing the splits, but not of the legs, but of the mind. So trying to wrap your head around two sort of seemingly contradictory ideas. And Central Asia is a great case study of this in the sense that I can tell you a story, actually. Bukharans take pride in recounting the story of when the Afghan Mujahideen took Soviet soldiers as prisoners during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. They would always ask them where they came from. If they came from Christian parts of the Soviet Union, from Russia, Belarus, or Ukraine, for example, they were executed. If they were from Central Asia, they were released. And if they were from Bukhara, the Afghan Mujahideen would not only set the prisoners free, they would even show them reverence and respond with Amin, sort of Amen. So again, bringing these two sort of seemingly contradictory ideas together, Marx and Muhammad, something that most people don't put into the same sentence or the same idea, but we're not the only ones to do so. Ali Shariati was one to do so, as well as Olivier Roy, an eminent scholar of Islam today, but also Norman Brown, who was a professor of Blake and psychoanalysis at the University of Santa Cruz, and he famously, and I'll quote, called Marxism and Islam two still revolutionary forces, two tired old horses, neither of them doing very well, but it would be a mistake to take any comfort from their failure. The human race is at stake, and they both, Marxism and Islam, agree on one proposition: there will be one world or there shall be none. Norman Brown also went on to say that nobody could understand the Quran in translation in the Western world until James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake appeared, because we didn't know what a modernist text was, because we didn't understand the idea of cyclical time. It's not a joke. We didn't understand the notion of a cyclical time, of characters morphing into one another. I mean, earlier we had the pleasure of seeing, I think, a scene from Lost Highway. But you know, in the Quran, Joseph becomes Haggart, Haggart becomes Jesus, Jesus becomes Moses, Moses becomes Muhammad. In the Old and New Testament, sort of Jesus remains Jesus, Moses remains Moses, and he even identifies 110 of 114 surahs of the Quran in Finnegan's Wake. So this region goes under several names. I think some of these are cut off: Transoxiana, Turkestan, East or West, depending on whether you're, I guess, pro-Russian or pro-Chinese. Khorasan, Mawara al-Nahr, meaning the country beyond the river, or Central Asia. What's interesting is that this is a region which is not only, let's say, forgotten by the West, but by ourselves as, let's say, people of the region. I'm always quite interested in the fact that when it's not just Manasa, but I guess if it's NA stands for nervous anxiety, SA would stand for what? But Mideast, North Africa, and South Asia. And when you apply for these prizes, for example, Abraj Prize or funding, you know, and my first question that comes to mind is, well, what happened to Central Asia? How could we forget Bukhara, Samarkand? I mean, it's arguably Bukhara is the fourth holiest city in Islam after, after Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. It's arguably one of the most important centers of scholarship with Baghdad and Cairo. And yet it doesn't figure on any of these acronyms. And in fact, to respond to Mariam's presentation, acronyms are equally a Soviet tradition as they are American. So I think it's a Cold War practice. So of course, Bukhara is and Khwarezm and Samarkand are the regions where, of course, astronomy with Al-Biruni, algebra, as well as Ibn Sina was happening. And what's interesting about the Central Asia is it's the demodernization of Islam in Central Asia. It's a fact that that Islam was outlawed, that it was allowed to maintain its progressive potential. It was through its oral character was maintained, in fact, because it was outlawed. Whether it was a syncretism of Central Asia's approach to Islam, or which sees shrines to many saints. In fact, there's a legend that says that Bukhara is one of the only places in the world where it's not heaven's light which shines and lights up the city, but it's actually Bukhara's light which shines up the heavens. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'll just, so that's awesome, Sufi girl power. It's the best way to start, right? You can tell I'm the professor in the group, right? I have my laptop and I'm gonna be scrolling through some notes. My starting point is the idea of the body as being disorienting. In traversing a topography of anxiety, the uncertainty of passing is crucial. In my mind, anxiety is linked with a desire. If anxiety is geographically based, which we've just heard it is, in fact, it is then desire of the authentic subject or subjectivity that I will be contending with, in particular the crisis of belonging in relation to labor. I'm going to use my time here to tell some short stories. My hope is that through these stories we might extrapolate ways of understanding connections between land, labor, and the body. My first story, and I'm using myself as an example for all of these stories because I also recognize that in this particular place, utilizing ethnographic examples or stories from outside is actually kind of dangerous, especially when you talk about belonging to a land, and you'll understand why as we move forward. My first story takes place in 1979 in New Jersey, in southern Jersey to be precise, in the United States. I remember asking my grandmother where I was from, where were we from, and being told in Urdu that we came from the earth. And we were made of a combination of mitti, which is dirt or soil, and pani, which is water. Subsequently, I found out that she did not come up with that brilliance herself. In fact, she was quoting the Quran. My second story takes place in January of 2009 in a checkpoint in Qazmen. Qazmen is a suburb of Baghdad, southeast of Baghdad, in Iraq. And I remember it's 2009, so it's a time of war. And in a time of war, every body is constantly being read, interpreted, and contextualized, especially inside checkpoints. Inside this particular gendered female checkpoint, the female security guard were all ready with their own questions as they ran their hands over my chest, my arms, my legs, and asked me where I was from in at least 3 languages. Arabic, Persian, and Urdu were always a constant, but they tried many others. And I always answered back, I'm American. At which point they would laugh and pinch their fingers in front of their faces and wave it back and forth and say, Asli, Asli, your origin, your essence. Besides the sort of existential trauma that put me into, I would try multiple answers to see what might suffice in terms of what they might believe I was. And the one answer that always got me through a checkpoint was, I'm an archaeologist. In January of this year, I went to visit the site of Tel Abrak, an archaeological site in the Emirate of Sharjah. The earth was being excavated by men wearing shalwar kameez and speaking in Urdu. As I walked through the site with my driver, they stopped their work to watch a woman wearing a shalwar kameez walk onto the site and discuss its antiquity with the project and field directors. I could hear them talking amongst themselves about who I was. My driver, who was born on this land when it was still part of the Trucial States but holds a passport of Bangladesh, began to explain to them what I was doing. She's looking for people like us from a long time ago. And in the ensuing conversation, my research agenda of locating Harappan sites in the United Arab Emirates unfolded in the vernacular. Later, I asked the driver about the conversation, and he said they all thought it would be amazing if you, an archaeologist, could show the people of the world that people from South Asia had been here for 5,000 years. I pointed out that culture changes, and we cannot make a direct link between what may have happened 5,000 years ago and what is happening today. Yes, he said with a smile, but it would be great to know that we may have built that culture change on this land. Thank you.
Let me introduce our discussion with a brief reflection on that notion which Shumon invoked at the beginning of this forum, which is the central task of this forum, definition and definitionism. How do we define something? And both Shumon and HG marvelously reduced that idea to 3 words. It means this. We often believe that it stands for the object. But after psychoanalysis, Gabriel Garcia Marquez and Gilles Deleuze, as Charles told us, we know that it does not stand for the object, but rather for desire, what we want. And what we want is this. Sometimes this may be Coke, as in Coke is it. And this is a Colombian telling you this, so take it with a twist of, you know. Coke is this. Coke is it. But we also know that whatever it, this is never enough. Coke never quenches our thirst. We will want another one. And so that is the very nature of desire. It is precisely that which we want to possess, which we think we can have, which we invade, which we take, and so on, and yet always goes beyond us. So we keep pursuing it. Means, then, the second word, the word in between, stands for that perseverance. And that perseverance is what we often call courage. And there you have it. Behind definition and definitionism, you find an ethics and also a politics. Perseverance, courage in the face of catastrophe, uncertainty, and anxiety. To keep going. I was reminded just a few minutes ago by Sultan that in the most well-known Latin American novel, Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, there is a constant, repetitious appearance of a character which is always in the first person of the plural, the Turks, los turcos. Sultan, very inquisitive mind, phones his Colombian friend. My friend, I didn't know you had Turkish people in Colombia. And the Colombian friend replies, no, the Turcos are not the Turkish, it's you guys. The Syrians, the Lebanese, the Saudis, and that connection, which is in our childhood memory, most of my friends were Syrians and Lebanese, all of them were Muslim. The first political image that I learned to recognize was not Ernesto Che Guevara or Fidel Castro, it was Yasser Arafat. Because they had it in all, this picture of this guy in all of their houses. Who's that guy? Yasser Arafat. Another bearded guy. We have bearded guys too. It also goes back, it harks back to our common and hidden stories from the time of colonialism, 16th and 17th century. You mentioned a few important, perhaps holy sites, but Payam would also include, because we were talking about this before, Córdoba. I was in Beirut last year for the Hay Literary Festival there, and in one of the walls inside the refugee camp of Shatila, I saw this wonderful graffiti, "Return to Al-Andalus." And that reminded me that for us, Latin Americans, particularly those of us who grew up in the northern coast, in the Caribbean, from Brazil all the way to Panama, including the Caribbean islands, the Middle East is neither a region nor the cause of anxiety. For us, is desire, is id. If China is the superego, then this is the id. And therefore, it is what we always want to go back to. But not as a figure of the past, rather as an image of the future. You know very well, because you have read my book, and if you haven't, shame on you, that Latin America is now, at this point, the land of hope. I mean, go anywhere in Latin America. You go to Brazil, to Argentina, to Bolivia, anywhere. And we're the happiest, the most hopeful. Crisis? What are you talking about? We're having fun here. The economy is growing, and for the first time, the Americans are kind of busy elsewhere. So, yeah, no longer the